All right, everyone, welcome. And I apologize for the my printer, and also apparently my neighbors are mowing. So if you will give me one moment, I'm going to put on my headset so that way you all will be able to hear me a little bit better. But man, what a week today has been. If you're joining us live right now, I hope you are fighting the good fight, and I'm happy that we're all here today to talk about beer and to talk about how beer and we're going to start today with some sensory techniques and descriptive language. I hope you all have a beer handy as well as a BJCP score sheet. If you don't, it's totally fine. And also, just as a reminder, we have got this recording live to YouTube, and this will be available on YouTube as well as in our members section for everyone to be able to see. So if you're watching this right now and you don't have a beer, you don't have a score sheet, or you're just watching in the future, that is definitely still available to you to taste through everything and work through the score sheet. So what I want to do today is start out by talking about sensory, how we perceive and how we perceive beer specifically. Then we're going to talk about descriptive language and how to really convey a lot of information in a few amount of words on score sheets to be effective, to be clear, and to make sure that we're giving the entrance great feedback, and also making sure that as judges we're really learning how to challenge ourselves to continue to develop our palates. And then at the very end, I'm going to recommend some resources for you, again hearkening back to the interest meetings we had. It's not at all necessary to have any additional resources outside of your BJCP guidelines and the other print resources that we shared in the members area of the website. But every time I talk about sensory, one, I get really excited about it. As you can probably tell behind me, I have all of these beer flavor maps. I love talking about sensory, and I really love picking apart beer flavor and where it comes from and how we perceive it. So I've got a big stack of books to recommend for anyone who also finds this interesting and would like to learn more. But before we do that, I'm going to pull up my slides here for all of us to talk through our sensory techniques and descriptive language. And of course, as we go through this, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will definitely take a couple of breaks throughout this to be able to go through those questions with you all. And just as a reminder, this is a completely safe space for asking questions. If you've got a question, ask it. Don't worry about whether you're asking it correctly or asking the right thing. I think as we've all learned over the past few days as women in beer, we need to feel safe speaking up. So I want you to feel safe speaking up and answering, asking your questions in that Q&A throughout. So all of that being said, let's get started with talking about some sensory techniques and descriptive language. So one of the first things we're going to do, there we go, now it's working for me. So the way we're going to lay this out today is talking about taste and flavor. We're going to talk about components of evaluation. Then we'll move on to descriptive language. We'll talk briefly about beer flavors and sources. And really that's going to be really pretty brief because we could talk for hours about that. And as you'll see, when we start to move through each one of those beer styles each week, we will address the grassy Pilsner malt flavors and all of that. So we will definitely get in the weeds on the beer flavors as we get within the styles. So for today, I really just wanted to give you an overview, basically a slide on each ingredient on as you're tasting beer, if you're getting flavors that are, fruity, would that be coming from the hops or the yeast? If you're getting those bread flavors or coffee, that's going to be coming from the malt. But we'll talk all about that in just a few moments. And then we'll wrap up with some best practices. So when we're talking about taste and flavor and how we perceive things, a lot of times what we call flavor or taste is actually aroma. And aroma is a
really cool, just a super cool thing. And as in some of the books that I will recommend later, aroma and how we perceive aroma really isn't that well known, and specifically talking about the kind of gustatory sciences, so how we taste, how we smell. It's hasn't really gotten a lot of attention the same way that other parts of human biology have, and particularly aroma and how we smell things and what that means. So this is an area where the science is new all the time. And it's really fascinating. I've got it in here. The sense of aroma ties directly into like that lizard brain of ours. And I know that we've all had that experience of smelling something or just getting a whiff of something, and you're immediately transported back to a very specific moment in your life. And that's how powerful aroma is. It's actually so powerful that when working with patients with dementia, with Alzheimer's, a lot of times therapy through aroma, not aromatherapy, as I think most of us are probably familiar with it, but using aroma to help, generate those memories and make those connections is actually something that's very powerful for memory loss. So, as you can tell, I could talk about aroma all day and how cool I think it is, but I will try to stay on topic. So when we're talking about aroma, there's going to be two ways that we perceive aroma. It's going to be orthonasal and retronasal. And I do have this note in here as well, as we can taste the 5 basic senses, potentially more, but we can distinguish thousands of volatile chemical compounds. And really, genetically, we all have thousands of aroma receptors, and different people have different combinations turned on, which is why you might be able to smell something like violets and I can't, which is actually a real example of the compound that makes violets, the flowers, smell like violets, is known as beta ionone, and 50% of the population is anosmic to that. So that means anosmic, meaning that you are unable to smell it. And I have found out about myself that I am unable to smell that compound. So different people are going to be able to perceive different aromas. So back to our 2 ways that we can perceive. Orthonasal is going to be what you can perceive as you're inhaling. So just straight inhaling, what do you perceive? Retronasal is going to happen, and I will try to take a sip and not choke, and then continue talking. But retronasal is what happens when we detect the aromas coming out of our mouth and nose. So hopefully I do this as elegantly as I can. But to demonstrate retronasal, that's retronasal. What you're doing as you have the food or the liquid on your palate and you swallowed it and you're breathing out is you are releasing all of those aromas into your nasal cavity. And that's where you're really going to perceive so much more aroma. And a good example to demonstrate orthonasal and retronasal is, think about when you have a cold and you're stuffed up, and your nose is stuffed up, your sinuses are stuffed up, and you say that you can't taste anything. What you're really unable to do is perceive aroma because your retronasal pathways are blocked. So it's when we're talking about, about score sheets specifically, and you'll see on the BJCP score sheet, there's aroma, appearance, flavor, and mouthfeel. So mouthfeel is really going to be where that taste component comes in, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But just know that a lot of times people will use flavor or taste when they really mean aroma. And you'll even hear me say, if I'm talking about flavor, what I'm really talking about is that aroma, or the overall impression of the interplay between flavor, or between aroma and taste. So with our basic senses, this is where we're talking about: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Those are our 5 basic senses. So again, if you think about demonstrating taste versus aroma, I have tried to do this once before and it was a really dumb idea. So I'm not going to try to talk my way through this, but if you are at home tasting along with your beer, plug your nose, take a sip of beer, and you will be able to feel things such as carbonation, bitterness, sweetness. If you're drinking a beer that has some acidity to it, you'll be able to feel that sour, that acidity on your palate, and then unplug your nose and and all of a sudden you're getting all those aromas. So that's a great way to demonstrate the difference between taste and aroma. So the most of what we're going to get in tasting is going to be, the balance, the interplay between sweetness and bitterness, sometimes acidity or sourness. We're really not going to see things like salt and umami as often. You may see it from time to time, depending on the style or if you have an older beer. But generally, when we're talking about taste, you're going to be picking up more on sweetness, bitterness, and sometimes acidity. So when we talk about the tongue map, the old tongue map we have on here, that's actually junk science from back in the days of phrenology, that it's one of those really weird things that just got adopted into like textbooks and science, and nobody ever questioned it until actually fairly recently to say that's not actually how the human tongue works. So if you've seen this, I had this in my textbooks in junior high, and I'm not that old. You don't only taste sweet on the front of your tongue. You don't only taste bitter in the back of your tongue. You actually have papilla all over your tongue that are, each one is going to have, first of all, we have 4 different kinds of papilla. Each one has a different role to play, but really what we care about is that fungiform papilla, as well as the foliate and the circumvallate, which within each one of those papilla are going to be, you can see hopefully on this picture, the different colors. So within each papilla, you're going to be able to taste all of those different tastes. So umami, sweet, sour, salty, and bitter. That's why it's important when you're drinking beer that you want to move it around your palate so you can make sure that you're hitting, all of those different papilla and getting as much out of that taste as you can. So this is kind of the same idea of just holding your nose and taking a drink of beer. But if you have something like a jelly bean or a ginger drop, anything that's going to be, have that kind of flavor to it, but also have some sort of sweetness component to it, you just plug your nose and chew. And what you will find is you'll be able to get the sweetness. You'll be able to get, if there's any kind of bitterness, but that's all you're going to be able to get. And then you release your nose, and all of a sudden you're releasing all of that flavor, all of that aroma that you couldn't perceive with your nose plug. And one way that I've done this before is to have a mix of cherry and cinnamon jelly bellies in the same, in the same cup, because they're the exact same color. And so I would pass the cup around and say, take one jelly bean, plug your nose, chew it, get that flavor of the sweetness, the sugar, and then release and tell me what flavor you have. And that's always a really great experiment. But then I left that cup of jelly bellies on my desk, and my supervisor came in and, was like, oh, cool, jelly bellies. And just got a handful and put them in his mouth before I could stop him. I was chewing it and was like, what flavor is this? Because he had a mix of cherry and cinnamon, and it's not a wholly unpleasant flavor, but it's not a great combination. So also, caveat, I don't know if caveat emptor exactly applies here, but, candy snatcher beware. If there's candy on my desk, it might not be what you think it is. So on a beer judging note, and we'll talk about this as well when we get into the actual components of evaluating beer, but sweetness, sourness, those are tastes, they're not smells. And this is getting a little pedantic about things, but I think as you're starting out, this is the kind of information that if somebody would have told me this distinction, and it's common sense, but it's not necessarily something that we think about or think through, but it's not correct. It's not the most correct to use sweet or sour as an aroma descriptor, because those are tastes. So I say that, and then the follow-up to that is when you smell something that you would describe as sweet, that's the time to really challenge yourself, challenge your palate, and think, what what precisely am I smelling that is registering to me as sweet? For myself, a lot of times it's if a beer has a lot of caramel, like caramel from the caramel malt. If it has any kind of like a vanilla kind of component to it, vanilla is very highly associated with sweetness in our brains, and it's also a very good masker. So if if you smell vanilla, and I'm sure, if you've ever made a mistake when you're cooking a recipe and use too much vanilla, like everything's going to taste like vanilla. But if you're smelling something that your brain says, this is sweet, that's an indication to say, okay, brain, like we're almost there, right? We're headed in the right direction, but we can actually dig down a little bit deeper and figure out what is my brain smelling that is saying sweet. So the same is true about sour. If you say something smells sour, it's a good idea to think, does it smell like sour milk? Does it smell like yogurt? Does it smell more like citrus? Like, is it like a citric acid kind of sour smell, or is it like vinegar? So each one of those are different kinds of acid that will add that acidity or sourness to a beer. So if you're smelling sour, again, take a minute to think, okay, what kind of sour? Would I say that this is sour milk sour? So sourness, sweetness, both of those are tastes and not technically the most correct terms to use as aroma descriptors. So then when we talk about mouthfeel, this is the actual tactile sensation that beer is going to produce in your mouth. And when we're talking about mouthfeel, particularly for a competition, for an exam, for evaluating components of mouthfeel, there's going to be 5 main components. There's going to be body, carbonation, warmth, creaminess, and astringency. Now, not every beer will have warmth or creaminess and astringency, but a good rule of thumb to keep in mind when you're filling out a score sheet, when you're evaluating a beer, is that you will always be able to perceive the body and to perceive the carbonation. So another important thing to remember about this is that the absence of a perception is still a perception. So let's say, for example, the example I have here, if you've got something like a Belgian Golden Strong Ale that's supposed to have really high carbonation and there's no carbonation at all, that's still a perception. And so that's when you can write down there's no carbonation. So just keep in mind that for every beer we evaluate, you'll want to talk about the body, you'll want to talk about the carbonation. Now, with something like creaminess, warmth, astringency, that's going to be dependent on the style. And so when we're talking about warmth, we're talking about like the alcohol warmth. So if you've had, even thinking about liquor, when you drink it, you feel that warmth in your palate. You wouldn't expect warmth from something like an American light lager. So like if you had a Bud Light and you were getting alcohol warmth, that would be super weird. If you were having a Russian Imperial Stout and you get some alcohol warmth, that's appropriate. And that's when you would say, I get moderate alcohol warmth. The same for creaminess and astringency. Not every beer style is going to have a perception of creaminess or astringency, but just remember, every single beer you ever evaluate, you can talk about the body, you can talk about the carbonation. So now that we've done that, we'll move on to the components of evaluation. And I apologize, I've got my my webcam is like right over where the little toolbar is, so I can't see if there's a question yet or not. But if there is, when I'm finished with these slides, I will get to that. So the components of evaluation. This is when we're going to talk about how we're going to fill out that BJCP score sheet. So the first thing we're going to assess, I shouldn't say the first thing that appears, it's not even the first thing that appears on the BJCP score sheet, but we're going to talk about appearance first. When we're looking at the appearance of the beer, we're not just looking at its color, but we're also looking at its clarity, its head retention, the head color, and the head texture. And so if you do have a BJCP score sheet, you can see under appearance, it says comment on color, clarity, and head. And within head, comment on retention, color, and texture. So again, the absence of a perception is still a perception. So if this beer, I would say, this has a low head. It has low head retention. I also know this beer has been sitting on my kitchen counter for a few minutes before I could get to it. But I would say that this has a low head retention. And for something like an American IPA, which is what this is, you would expect it to be moderate. So I would just say this is, we'll say golden in color, with moderate clarity and a thin white head with low retention. And that's my appearance description right there. So when we're talking about color specifically in beer, they use SRM, which is unimaginatively stands for standard reference method. That's what's used to assess the color of the beer. So if you also have your BJCP guidelines downloaded on your phone, when you open up each style at the top, there's a little color on there, and that actually shows you the scale of what color that beer is supposed to be. And it took me longer than I would care to admit to see that and realize that that's what it was at the top of each one of the beer styles. So now you know when you open it. But there's also several charts and visual aids that are available. If you decide to go through the BJCP program, I can attest to you that I need to ask them to please stop sending me SRM charts, because I randomly get little like pocket size SRM charts in the mail, which is fantastic when you have one. Or, at this point I have like 2 on my refrigerator, 1 in my desk, 1 in my purse, 1 in my car, because I keep getting them. So just know that those SRM charts exist, and they can be very helpful when you're kind of learning what kind of color, or not what kind of color, but SRM wise, is this pale amber, or is it deep gold? And a lot of times it's going to be subjective. And if you said this is dark brown, then we've got a problem. If you say this is bright red, not so much. But if you say this is deep golden versus this is amber, we're talking about the same general color. So don't get too hung up on getting the precise SRM color. Just learn the ranges of beer color. So the SRM scale goes from very pale gold or pale yellow. So think of something again like a Bud Light. An American light lager is very, very pale. It's one of the palest colors of beer. That's a 1. And we go all the way up to 40 plus, which is jet black. So if you have something like a Russian Imperial Stout, that's going to be closer to 40. If you think about those beers that are really, really dark, those are going to be approaching 40. And so when we're talking about clarity, that's going to be the brightness of the beer. How easy is it for that beer to see through? And if you're looking at the guidelines with, whatever style you're drinking, it will tell you what the clarity should be. So it's usually, it can be opaque, hazy, moderate clarity, even good clarity, which isn't the best description. Because it's just not as specific as it could be, or brilliant clarity. So brilliant clarity is, again, thinking of something like an American light lager that is just crystal clear. That's brilliant clarity. And I will generally judge clarity by, holding it up to something and determining like, how well can I see through this beer? So again, you don't need to get too worried about precisely nailing the clarity. Your guidelines will tell you like this beer should be moderately clear to hazy. And, then you can be like, okay, yeah, then that's within the style for this for this beer style. Head retention, typically described in general terms, good, moderate, long lasting. Again, those aren't the very best descriptors, but when it comes to something like head retention, it's really how long did that head stick around? And so generally I'll say like this has moderate retention or low retention, or it was very long lasting. And then the foam color, the really interesting thing about foam color, and your guidelines will tell you this as well when you're looking at each individual style, but with foam color, it can give you an indication of what kind of malt or other additives were used in the beer. So if, instead of this being an American IPA, this is an American wild ale with raspberries added, then we would expect that head to be kind of pink from the raspberries. or again, using an imperial stout, something with a lot of roasted grain in it, that's going to make the head of that beer kind of tan in color, or even, starting to get into like dark, like a brown color. So when we're talking about aroma, this is the part, so I managed not to choke in the beginning when I was drinking beer. This is the part where I will almost definitely spill beer on myself. But when we're talking about aroma and how to assess aroma, there are really 5 main techniques for assessing aroma. That's the long sniff, the short sniff, the drive-by, and the covered sniff. I think I covered all 5 right there. So for each one of these, they're fairly self-explanatory. Long sniff is just a few inches below your nose. What do you smell with that? What can you perceive? The short sniff is, yes, short sniff is next. So short sniff is just 1 to 2 seconds. What do you perceive? Long sniff, a little bit longer than 1 to 2 seconds. And then the drive-by is just like that, back and forth. Each one of these methods will help you detect different components. So with something like the drive-by, this is great if you have something, if you think about a beer that's skunky, that's light struck, any kind of like sulfuric or sulfitic aroma, you're going to best perceive by doing the drive-by for a couple of reasons. One, we're very sensitive to those aromas. So if you think of something like a skunk, it is like parts per billion that we can detect a skunk smell, which is very useful to us as human beings. That's why we can detect it at very low levels, and it takes just a little bit of skunk smell for us to be able to pick up on that. So something like a drive-by, that's really all you need with aromas like that. The other thing with that is you become acclimated to that smell very quickly. So just like that quickly, you'll listen to your brain say light struck or skunk, and that's all you need. You've perceived that flavor. And then the last kind of sniff we'll talk about is the covered swirl and sniff, which is just what it sounds like. You're going to cover your glass, you're going to swirl it. What you're doing as you're swirling is you're building up all of these volatile aromas in that empty headspace. So you're really concentrating those aromas. So covered sniff or covered swirl, and then usually probably like a long sniff is going to give you a really good overview of what you're assessing in the beer, what you're perceiving in the beer. And as you're starting out, I think that it's always helpful to walk through each one of these 5 different ways to perceive aroma, because some of the flavors you will find for yourself, you pick up better doing it one way or doing it another way. Your covered swirl and sniff is going to be your great all-purpose. If you're judging at a competition, one of the first things I'll do is do a short sniff, and then I'll do the covered swirl and sniff, and I'll go from there. And if I feel like I need to do like a drive-by or something like that, then I'll do it. But it's important, as you're practicing at home, to experiment with each 5 of the ways to perceive aroma for each beer that you try, and see for you specifically what works the best in terms of, kind of that all purpose. So my covered swirl and sniff is my all purpose. It might not be yours. Figuring out all purpose, what works for you, and then also figuring out how each one of the different techniques will help you perceive different flavors. So I've got an example for that with DMS, which is dimethyl sulfide. That is a very like canned corn, kind of like seafood water sort of aroma. And I'm not very strong at detecting that. That's something I've learned about myself. But then I was in an off flavors class, and the instructor said for DMS, one way that works for people is to do a covered swirl and then do a drive-by. But instead of doing a drive-by from right to left, do a drive-by from back to front. And I tried it that way and was able to pick up DMS. So now I know when I'm doing my normal all-purpose covered swirl and sniff, if something in my brain is like, was that DMS? Then I'll go to this covered and like back to front drive-by sniff to see if I can pick up on DMS. And, typically I will be able to, but I don't do that with every single beer. Just when I think that I have, something that I need to if I'm looking for DMS in there. And then, as always, if you find yourself becoming acclimated to a sample, which happens, smell the inside of your elbow or smell the sleeve of your shirt, something like that. The way you are used to the way your skin smells, you're used to the way your laundry smells. That's a great way to, it won't exactly reset your palate, but it will give your nose a break and kind of get it back to a, to a more neutral spot. Another thing I've done before too, if I find myself getting acclimated, is I'll just set the beer down and take a beat and just kind of breathe, breathe in fresh air and let that reset my palate. Some of the things that you may also have heard is something like coffee beans. That was something that was used in the perfume world that actually in one of the books I'll recommend, he talks about trying to find the authority for that, where that came from. And it was kind of like the tongue map. Like it was just something that some person said one time and everybody just went with it. So sniffing coffee beans doesn't actually reset your palate the way that a lot of people in the perfume world think that it does. If you find that sniffing coffee beans helps reset your palate, then do it. I think that's totally fine. And we'll talk about how susceptible we are to the power of suggestion in a few minutes. But I feel like that goes both ways. So if you have a method that works for you and it's proven for you, then keep doing that. So when we're talking about flavor, we're really talking again about those same flavor components that we saw from the ingredients. And what we're going to be doing, and we'll talk about descriptive language in a few minutes, we want to look for contributions from the malt, the hops, fermentation, other aromatics, as well as assessing bitterness, balance, finish, and aftertaste. And all of these things are written right here for you. So as you're filling out a score sheet, using these prompts that are telling you what to comment on is a great way to make sure that you are covering everything and giving a thorough description of the beer. Again, I mentioned this last week, you want to try to add intensity as well as flavor. So it's not just bread crust. It's moderate bread crust or it's high citrus aroma. Adding the intensity, so again, what kind and how much, make sure to add intensity to each one of your descriptors. And really that intensity and being able to assess it and, having confidence in what that assessment is going to come with practice. So when you are smelling, when you're assessing beers, evaluating beers, you can start focus first on really getting those flavors nailed down. And then as you gain more experience, it will be easier for you to assess the intensity. So again, absence of something is still an evaluation. If you're drinking an American stout and you don't perceive any kind of roasted malt flavors, that's a perception, write it down. And what else do I have on here? Yes. Another thing to remember as you're filling out score sheets is if there's something that was in the aroma that you didn't get in the flavor, you can point that out as well. If there is, or if it's changed significantly. So one really common one for me is I might get huge diacetyl in the aroma, but when I get to the flavor, I don't actually pick that up. So that's something that I would write down is, diacetyl from the aroma is not present in the flavor. And then mouthfeel. So a lot of times when we're talking about mouthfeels, you get more experience with filling out a score sheet and assessing beer and kind of doing both at the same time. A lot of times you can, in that one or two sips that you have for flavor, you can also just evaluate what your mouthfeel is as well. So remember that we will always comment on body and carbonation. Those are super easy places to start. And make sure if you're not expecting, and you shouldn't expect creaminess, astringency, alcohol, warmth in every beer, make sure to note it if you do, especially if it's appropriate or inappropriate for a style. And other kinds of components of mouthfeel that I will note sometime is if there's a lot of carbonation, maybe you get that carbonic prickliness on your tongue, and just noting that as well. So we're doing that, and I'm seeing I'm going to stop this share for just a moment because I know I'm seeing questions pop up and I want to make sure that it's not like, we can't hear you or something. So, okay, so do we need to touch on foam description like tight, uniform bubbles? I think that that is, if you can, I think that that's great. So that's a comment on the texture of the head, and that not, I don't do it 100% of the time, but if it's something that's characteristic of this style, it is good to note. Or sometimes you might get beer with zero head and like really big bubbles. That's not good either. So you would say like, hey, I big disconnected bubbles, no head retention. So yes, if you can touch on the foam description, definitely do that. Good palate cleanser between samples. Yes, this is a great question. I was just talking to somebody about this on Sunday, which apparently was yesterday. Today has been a week, but a good palate cleanser between samples. This depends on who you ask. I will say the standard, which has been adopted from the wine industry, is something like unsalted crackers. So unsalted saltines. I prefer water crackers, oyster crackers. If you're someplace like JABF or National Homebrew Competition, they actually have this matzah that they will give you that is, unsalted, unleavened, and that's a good palate cleanser. Depending on the style that I'm judging, I don't always cleanse my palate between every single style. If I'm doing something like a fruit and spice category where I could have a Berliner Weiss with like lemon peel and blueberries. And then my next beer is going to be a Russian Imperial Stout with raspberries, right? I would do a palate cleanser in between those, just because the flavors are so disparate and so distinct. Other things that are good, water is really the best palate cleanser. If you have carbonated water, that's really great too, because similar, if you think through, one reason when a lot of times beer styles and food are really good matches is if you've got something that's really heavy or have a lot of fat and you pair that with something with high carbonation. You do that because that high carbonation is going to help lift all of those, that fattiness or creaminess or all of those flavors off of your palate. So plain carbonated water is going to be a great palate cleanser for that very reason, because those bubbles are going to help kind of scrub your palate of the flavors. Some people will say that anything that's like a flour base, so crackers, popcorn, pretzels, something like that wouldn't be a good palate cleanser because a lot of those flavors are present in malt as well. And you find those flavors in beer. Again, if you find that through your own experiences that something like crackers or matzah or oyster crackers are going to mess up your palate too much, then stick with just water. And again, thyme can be a great palate cleanser as well. But generally speaking, the any kind of starchy thing is going to help cleanse your palate. Okay, so then for consistency, I've been given instruction to use the same background for judging color clarity like the back of a score sheet. Is that actually useful as a best practice, or meh, not so much? I think that it is useful. I will generally, when I'm judging somewhere, will try to find like a white wall around me. So sometimes it may be like me like back here trying to find someplace good to do that. I think for example, when I'm doing our sensory panels at the brewery, we do it in an event room. I don't have any white walls. There's, one wall of windows that looks out onto the brew house. So I just use a consistent background. That is like the second best solution. But yes, if you've got, this is recycled paper, but if you've got a blank sheet of paper, if you've got a white wall around you, use that to evaluate your color and clarity. Let's see. At a beer competition where I worked as a pourer, we poured the beer in flight glasses, then took them to the judges. Is that typical, or are judges supposed to pour it themselves? Seems like pouring in advance would affect scores such as aroma and head retention. This is a really great question as well. If you're doing something like GABF, National Homebrew Competition, I think FOBAB does this, the Festival of Barrel Aged Beers. A lot of pro competitions will bring the samples to you. The reason for that being, when they're submitting those samples, they've got, they're submitting their labels, like their regular cans and bottles. So the samples will be poured somewhere where the judges can't see that. For something like a homebrew competition, the entrants are supposed to submit in a completely, blank brown bottle with just the label like rubber banded on it. And then within the competition admin, they replace that label with something else. But the point of that being that if everybody's using a brown bottle, you can't tell whose is who. So that's why a lot of times you'll see, if you're at like a BJCP or a homebrew competition, the judges will have the beers there and they will pour the beers. I've done both, and it really depends on how people were able to submit the entries. So if you're able to tell who brewed the beer, then they're going to pour it somewhere and bring it to you. I've judged with people before who have asked the steward, this is going to sound, I can't not say it in a creepy way, but they'll be like, tell me what the beer looks like when it gets poured. And they're not always that creepy about it, but like, they'll just ask the steward, can you comment on the head retention? But generally samples will be poured and brought out to the judges quickly enough that won't impact it as much. So the only other time I can think of really when that would affect something like head retention, something like temperature, is if you're taking a Cicerone exam, and for the tasting portion, the proctor will pour everything ahead of time. So they could potentially be setting out for a little while, and they will tell you, hey, for purposes of your tasting exam, you don't need to worry about temperature or carbonation being a quality issue that you need to address, because they know just from the logistics of the exam that those have been setting out for a while. With aroma, that's another interesting one that it depends who you ask. There are people who will argue that there are volatile aromas that escape very quickly from the beer. So as soon as you get the beer, you should be smelling it. You'll also see people have like a coaster or something that they put over the top of the beer. If you feel like that's something that is helpful for you, then do that. I will always evaluate aroma first. For a few reasons. One, there are volatiles, but it's not, from my point of view, they're not going to escape so fast that I can't, I need to like immediately have the sample and smell it. But for another reason, when it usually gets poured is cold. So if I do aroma first, I can evaluate the aroma while it's a little bit cooler. And then I can revisit it when it's warmed up to see if there's, has there been a change in any of the flavors? Is something that was there before gone, and vice versa. That is a very long answer sort of to your question, Christine, but with the pourers, it really depends on whether the judges would be able to identify who the entrant was or not. So would you swirl only for the covered swirl or throughout all the sniffs? My default usually is just to start swirling. I think that's a great way to do it, and I'm not paying attention, so I will definitely spill it on myself. But yeah, when you do that, for a couple of reasons. One, when you're doing that, you are releasing those volatile aromas. Two, doing something like swirling your glass before you get ready to judge is a great way to signal to your brain, hey, we're about to judge beer. And this is different from just kicking back and drinking beer. So I will generally swirl it for a few seconds. That's something I learned from Randy Mosier recommends that in Tasting Beer. Dr. Bill Simpson from Aroxa says the same thing. You do something every time that signals to your brain, this is an evaluation. This isn't just drinking. Like we're ready to go, and it helps you get into that. So I will swirl throughout each one of the different sips. If I'm doing something like a long sniff, this is just the straight orthonasal. I want to see what I can get from it, just perceiving it as it is. Short sniff, yeah, usually I'll do a swirl for each one of those. Drive by, I'm not even going to attempt to do a swirl and drive by at the same time because that will be a disaster for me. But generally, I think a good swirl to help release those volatiles, and and then doing that would be will be a good practice to do. Is bread/dough more of an aroma or a flavor? Can it be both? We're going to get to that in just a moment, but when we're talking about aroma and flavor, a lot of times those are going to be interchangeable. So if it's something like bread dough, that's going to be a flavor from malt. You will be able to get it in the aroma as well as in the flavor. So when I'm saying in this context, when I'm saying aroma, I'm talking about smelling the beer. Flavor is that whole, the whole evaluation. So as you're drinking the beer, you're getting that retronasal aroma as well. That's actually where you're perceiving the flavor from. So bread dough, yeah, we will touch on that in just a moment, but it is a malt, it is a flavor from malt. The unsalted part of the palate cleanser. This, I know that the science is out there somewhere, and I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what it is, but basically with the salt, that can serve as an irritant to your palate. So unsalted is best. You're kind of limiting the amount of things that are going to interfere with the way that you perceive that beer. I will look up like the actual, that's me backing into a reason. I will look up the actual reason and let you know about that. Okay, so if we sense fruity, floral, or whatever character, should we try to identify and write down what might be the reason? Identifying between hop and ester fruitiness can be tough. Yes, yes to both of those things. So as you are practicing and and filling out your evaluation forms, you will, or your score sheets, you will learn the difference between fruitiness from hops, from the malt, from the yeast. And we'll talk a little bit about what kinds of flavors you would expect to see from hops versus yeast. And then again, as we're going through each one of the styles specifically, it will tell you that you should have, banana and pear esters and lemon hops. So you will learn what flavors should be from each ingredient as we're learning about the different styles. And then as you taste and develop your palate more, you'll be able to kind of start peeling away those layers to be able to identify where those flavors are coming from. And we'll talk about descriptive language in just a second. And yes, PDF note form. I have them in PDF form, but I can definitely put them in PDF note form if that's helpful for you all. So that is a great suggestion. And I will go back, anything that's been posted already, I'll just go back and add those back to the members area for you all. So if you want to print them out with being able to have the notes, I will also try. So my goal is to always have my slides done the day before. So if it will be helpful to be able to look at the slides and take notes along as we go through, I can definitely commit to making those available to you all PDF note form ahead of time. Okay, so I've answered these and I will go, I'm actually just realizing that I can just move this so I don't have to do a weird like ducking down thing to see all of these. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. And I will get back to the other questions. I know we just had a couple more pop up. So we're going to talk now about descriptive language. I'm going to take a sip of beer first. So with descriptive language, this really, for me is one of the more like most fun parts about doing sensory. So when we're talking about descriptive language, we're talking about something that can appeal to all five senses. So smell, taste, touch, sight, and sound. We want to be vivid and specific while working within that commonly accepted beer terminology. So that is where for me, that's where the fun comes from, is having that smell, that, like I said, you get that aroma and it immediately takes you to a very specific point in your life. And then working back into how does that fit into this commonly accepted lexicon. So I always like to think of it of giving a description of the beer to a police sketch artist. One of the things that one of the resources I'll recommend if you're wanting to learn more, particularly about descriptive language, is the Deductive Beer Tasting Method by Rich Higgins. And I'll have that noted later on in the slides. But what he says is, what is the beer shouting at you? When you take a sip of the beer, when you're evaluating the beer, what are the three things that beer is yelling at you? And once you have those down, then you can write down the next few descriptors that the beer is just saying to you, like we're just talking. And then you can write down what the beer might be whispering to you and then what the beer might not be saying at all. But when you've got something and you do that smell or you do the flavor and you're like, whoa, bitter, hops, a little bit of malt, or something like that, write down at first what immediately occurs to you, what you're getting out of it first. And you would expect something like an American IPA to have high bitterness or have a higher, have a high-ish level of bitterness, to have a really big hop character. You wouldn't expect a ton of malt character. So write down what the beer is shouting at you first. Start there. This is the challenge. You want to avoid being so specific that very few people will be able to visualize your description. So this is the example I use. If I say the yeast profile of some Belgian beers reminds me of my grandma's root cellar in Southwest Missouri, almost no one will understand my frame of reference. Although I will say, I believe that my sister is attending this session tonight, and she would be the one person out of like the 80 or so people who are on this session right now who'd be like, oh yeah, grandma's root cellar. But that doesn't mean anything to most of you. That's specific, it's vivid, it's evocative, but it's too specific. So, and I use that as an example because when I was learning about things like the different yeast profiles and different flavors in beer, there are some Belgian beers that I would smell it and be like, root cellar, this is Taneyville, Missouri root cellar. And that then learning that, okay, what I'm actually trying to convey is that with some Belgian beers, that yeast profile reminds me of damp earth and maybe a little bit of mustiness. So if I say damp earth, if I say mustiness, and I could probably even say cellar, I think, to most people, and they would have some sort of a reference point. But if I'm very, very specific, I'm not really conveying that much at all. Another example that I use is learning about specifically like sulfur compounds. And when I would smell certain beers, what would pop into my head was perm solution. And like I was immediately back in third grade, with like all the little hard rollers in my hair and that awful smell and having to sit there forever and hating it. And and then I also had like a perm that didn't look great, but I would always smell it and immediately think perm solution. And what I do when I get those kinds of really powerful connections is I just go to Google. I typed in like, what are the main chemical compounds of perm solution? And, they're sulfur based. So I was like, okay, now I know that this is something that is sulfuric or sulfitic. And then, walking that back into now when I smell something and my brain says perm solution, more than likely what I'm smelling is H2S, which is something that's, if you've had a perm, you know what perm solution smells like, but it's a very distinct sulfur smell. So, part of that journey in learning to evaluate beer is to first make those connections that are deeply personal to you. So when when you smell a beer, and this won't be every beer every time, but you will have throughout your learning, evaluating beer journey, you will have those moments of having a very strong, vivid reaction. Write that down. And then start doing the reverse engineering to figure out what it is that you're smelling that triggered that memory for you. So the other side of that is avoiding being so vague that you're not actually conveying any information. I'm just realizing now this is the second week in a row that I've had a Mean Girls reference in my slides, and that wasn't on purpose. I do have a caveat to that. I will get to that in a moment. But describing beer as malty, hoppy, sour, that's really too vague to communicate what the beer actually tastes like. For those of you who've heard me speak before, I joined New Rum from the malt industry, and hearing people describe malt as tasting malty drives me insane. It absolutely drives me insane. It's like if you said, what does this beer taste like? And I said, it tastes beery. It doesn't tell you anything. Like there's a whole range of flavors. So that's like a personal kind of a personal bon mot of mine. But the caveat to that is if you are brand new to tasting beer and you're at that level where you can discern that different ingredients create different flavors, that is an excellent starting point. So when I say, try to avoid being vague, if right now when you smell a beer, you're like, yep, I get malty, I get hoppy, or I can get sour, that's great. I don't want you to be discouraged from that. Know that that is a really great place to start, and we're only going to improve from there. And as we're talking, I think actually in like the next couple of slides, we'll kind of dig into being specific, how to be specific with the language, because we all have that vocabulary already. It's just a matter of training your brain to be very specific in the descriptors. So again, caveat, if malty, hoppy, sour is where you're at right now, that is an excellent starting point, and know that we're going to like dive even deeper into all of those sorts of things. So I was right. This is an example of descriptive language. If we're in this chat right now and I said, hey, this beer tastes fruity. So I've conveyed some information, in your mind. You're like, okay, fruit, got it. It's not broccoli, it's not chocolate, it's not coffee. Is she talking about tomato? I don't know, who knows? So you want to know what kind of fruit. It's citrus fruit. Great, that helps us narrow it down. It's not a banana, it's not a berry, we're talking about citrus fruit. But what kind of citrus fruit? Is oranges. Great. So, we've gone from fruity to oranges. So we're already very far more descriptive and evocative in our language. But there's all kinds of oranges. So are we talking about blood orange, navel orange, mandarin orange, and then you can say, okay, great, navel orange. We can go even farther than that. Are we talking about navel orange pulp, the pith, the peel? And those are all, for most of us, those are flavor references that we have, which is also why it's really important to do sensory on everything. A few weeks ago, I've got a picture of it. I think I had 10 different kinds of citrus fruit in front of me. I had pink grapefruit, white grapefruit, navel orange, mandarin, the sumo orange, blood orange, Meyer lemon, I guess regular lemon, key lime, regular lime. I had all of those and sat down, and it was a lot more work than I was anticipating, but tasting through, okay, navel, mandarin, sumo, like a little, cutie, a tangerine, and a blood orange. What does that pulp taste like? What does the pith taste like? What does the peel taste like? And doing that is what's going to help you develop your vocabulary. So that way, when you smell something, your brain's going to say navel orange pulp. So hopefully you can see by walking through that example, when we're talking about being specific and evocative, we have all of those tools already for so many different components, that going from this is fruity to this is navel orange pulp is, we're conveying so much more information, and it really didn't take a lot of work to get there. So it's just a matter really of training yourself on being as specific as possible when you're talking about descriptors. So next, we're going to touch on beer flavors and sources. This is going to be very high level. So just know that as we're going through each one of the beer styles from week to week, we will we will talk about the specific beer flavors from specific ingredients for each one of the styles. But I didn't want to do all this talking about filling out score sheets and being evocative and using descriptive language and talking about intensity, and not at least addressing the fact that it would be helpful to know generally what flavors come from what beer ingredients. So when we're talking about the beer ingredients, our 4 main ingredients are going to be malt, hops, water, and yeast. So today, I don't think I have a slide in here on water, but I do have some information on malt, hops, and yeast, and what kinds of flavors generally come from those ingredients. So when we're talking about malt, there's going to be 3 main types of malt. That's going to be base malt, caramel or crystal malt, and roasted malt. And within each one of those, there's going to be kind of different gradations of malt flavor and what each one is going to contribute to beer. So when we're talking about malt and malt flavors, think about bread, all stages of bread, from flour to bread dough to bread, bread crust, toast, burnt toast. All of those are going to generally, almost always, come from malt, the malt that's used in the beer. Likewise, you can have things like a caramel or crystal malt. Roasted malt is going to give you those flavors of, chocolate, toffee, coffee, even some bitterness, some acridity. But with base malt, we'll start, and there are more kinds of malt than what's listed here. But generally, for base malt, the ones you're going to see the most are going to be Pilsner, Pale, Vienna, and Munich. And even within each one of those, like, you can get, different variations of Munich malt. But thinking through the flavors, Pilsner malt has been kilned for the least amount of time. So it's been we'll think about it as like cooked. So if you're thinking about bread, so it is as close to the raw ingredient that you're going to get. So you're going to get a lot of those grassy flavors. Sometimes you can get hay if you've got, if you ever do like a malt sensory of Pilsner, different kinds of Pilsner malts, you will be really surprised at how much of the terroir you can get from the Pilsner malt, just because it hasn't been kilned for as long of a time. So it's going to retain a lot of those flavors that it grew out of the ground with. With pale malt, pale ale malt, that's when we're starting to get more into bread, water cracker. Vienna malt is going to be bread crust, nutty, kind of graham cracker, and Munich malt is going to be toast, caramel, pie crust. So you can think about, kind of, as we're baking the bread longer, we're developing those Maillard reactions, those browning reactions that are going to develop those flavors within the malt. The next category we have is caramel malt or crystal malt. There is a distinction. It's very pedantic. You don't need to worry about it. But caramel malt is going to give us caramel flavors, raisin, dark fruit, burnt sugar. And again, within caramel malt, that can go all the way from something like caramel, like a caramel 10 is going to have light caramel flavors, and go all the way down to something like a caramel 120 that's going to be very dark and have really rich kind of molasses flavors. And then we have roasted malt. So when we're talking about roasted malt, that's going to give us more intensity in the flavor. So that's where we're going to get a lot of our nuttiness, toast, again, baked bread, mild, sometimes a mild burnt flavor, coffee, chocolate, all the way to black malt, which is going to be that acridity, some bitterness, maybe even a little bit of burnt. So that is a very high level of malt flavor. Next, we'll talk about the traditional hop traits. So hops, our main hop growing regions are going to be Germany or the Czech Republic, England, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia. And also South Africa will fit in with that, New Zealand and Australia. But if something has German hops or Czech hops, a lot of times those flavors are going to be floral, perfumey, peppery, minty. And as you go through and taste beers, and particularly as you're comparing them to the beer style guidelines, it will tell you this should have a moderate noble hop or moderate German hop, floral, perfumey, peppery, minty flavor to it. With English hops, the main styles are going to be East Kent Goldings and Fuggles. There are other styles of English hops, but those are kind of the main two. Those are going to give you flavors that are herbal, that are woodsy, kind of earthy. In the United States, a lot of United States hops are going to be very, very different, one, from what you would expect from like a German hop or an English hop. They're going to be much more intense in flavor and in aroma. That's where we're going to get the piney, citrusy, the resiny, sometimes tropical fruit, sometimes dank, catty. A lot of those flavors are associated with United States hops. And then the last one is going to be New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. You may also see those referred to as New World hops. I know in a lot of the IPA guidelines for the BJCP, you will see them say, the hop flavor can be American or New World. New World, just know that that's talking about New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, more Southern Hemisphere hops. And with those, we're going to expect more tropical fruit, more kind of spicy, more wine-like. And when I say spicy, that's going to be more along the lines of like a, black pepper or a white pepper, and less so like allspice kind of thing. So spicy more along the lines of when you're thinking about like a spicy food, and less so like baking spices. So again, very high level of generally from the four main hop growing regions. Most of the beers you're going to be evaluating are going to have hops from one of these regions. So if you've got, a best bitter that's an English style, you would expect to have English hops in it. And that's really tasting through those different kinds of beer styles is going to be the best way to learn what those hops taste like. And I promise, as you do more evaluating, you do more judging, you do more thoughtful, I don't want to say thoughtful drinking, but as you're doing more sampling and writing down your perceptions, you will start to learn where you can smell something and say, okay, this smells like US hops because I get pine, I get citrus, I get that sort of thing. So I promise that as you work through it, you will get more confident in when you're smelling something, not only being able to dissect this is from the malt, the hops, or the yeast, or even your water sometimes, but also being able to say this is a German hop that I'm smelling right now. So fermentation flavors. When we're talking about fermentation, for a very long time, people thought fermentation was magic. I still think fermentation is pretty magical, but it's not. And generally, all beers are going to be either an ale or a lager. And that all depends on what kind of yeast strain that you're using. So lager yeast is described as having a crisper, cleaner taste. That's because it's not producing or it's producing little to no esters and phenols. And we'll talk about esters and phenols in just a moment. Ale yeast is much more genetically diverse than lager yeast. And so if you think of everything from an American stout to an English IPA, to a Weiss beer, to a Flanders red ale, to a Belgian double, those are all ales. Those are all styles of ales. And if you've had each one of those styles, you know that those are all very different flavors. So ale yeast is going to produce esters, which are going to be our fruity flavors, and phenols, which will be our spicy flavors. And depending on the different kind of yeast strain that you decide to use will depend on what level of esters and phenols that you get from the beers, from that fermentation character. So something like an American ale yeast is going to have a very clean fermentation. It's going to be very similar to a lager fermentation. So we would expect low esters, low phenols. An English ale yeast has a lot of, or I say a lot, it has more than American ale yeast, a lot of those fruity esters to it. So you get a lot of pear, apple, sometimes even a little bit of banana. Belgian ale yeast is going to be very complex. So if you're having a Belgian beer, with almost every Belgian beer style, that yeast is going to be the star of the show. So with Belgian ale yeast, we're going to have a complex blend of fruity esters, spicy phenols. With a Weizen yeast specifically, that is a Hefeweizen, Weissbier. They're the same style. You can use those style names interchangeably. That's where you get those high levels of banana and clove. So I think that thinking about a Hefeweizen beer is a great way to demonstrate what is an ester and what is a phenol, because that high banana flavor is an ester and that high clove flavor is the phenol. And then when we're talking about acidic fermentation, I touched on this a little bit earlier. Lactic acid bacteria is going to give you that flavor of like sour milk, or you think of like if you open up a container of yogurt, that aroma is going to be lactic acid. Acetic acid is going to give us a vinegar flavor. So think about red wine vinegar. So something like a Flanders red ale has a high level of acetic acid in it. And that's, when you smell it, you're going to think, okay, that's vinegar. So again, going back to sour not being the most correct aroma descriptor, think through and kind of learn, is this more of yogurt or is this more vinegar? When I say sour, what is it precisely that I'm detecting? And then Brettanomyces is its own thing. It's referred to as a wild yeast, but those flavors are going to range depending on the strain, depending on how old the beer is. That's going to go anywhere from floral, with a very young Brettanomyces beer or Brettanomyces fermentation, all the way to something like horse blanket that's going to be really funky. So if you see a beer that's described as wild, farmhouse, funky, that's going to be describing Brettanomyces more than likely. And just another kind of distinction to make, that wild does not mean sour. Wild beers and sour beers are two different things. You can have a wild beer that has acidity to it. You can have a sour beer that has a wild flavor to it, but that doesn't mean that those aren't interchangeable things. So if you see wild beer, what that hopefully is conveying, if the brewer is doing a good job of communicating clearly, a wild beer farmhouse funky is going to have Brettanomyces flavors in it. So it's going to be anywhere from that floral to horse blanket, whereas something that is described as a sour beer is going to have an acid component to it. That acidity is what is making the beer sour. It's lowering the pH, so it's very acidic. So that's going to be lactic acid bacteria, acetic acid bacteria. Overwhelmingly, those are going to be the two that you'll see in beer. There's other kinds of acidic flavors that you can get from fermentation that that's really kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about through these trainings. So more examples of phenols and esters. Something that would be esters is that fake banana. So in a Hefeweizen, that banana flavor is a compound known as isoamyl acetate. You don't have to know the chemical names for any of these. I guess I just included these in here as a flex, but esters, fake banana, nail polish remover, ripe mango, ripe strawberry, tinned pineapple, those are all going to be esters. And again, the more practice you have evaluating beer, the better you'll get at teasing apart, like, is this ripe mango flavor from the hops, or is it an ester from the beer, or is it a combination of both? So I promise you, as you get more experience with it, you will be able to tease those flavors apart at that kind of a level. Something like a phenol is going to be clove, again, so thinking through a Hefeweizen, that clove flavor is a phenol. Another kind of phenol that you see, unfortunately, quite a bit is chlorophenol. So if you get that medicinal flavor, or shower curtain, if your beer smells and tastes like a shower curtain, there's chlorophenols in there, or a swimming pool. And then something like 4-ethylphenol, that Band-Aid flavor, the 4-EP, that Band-Aid flavor is a hallmark of Brettanomyces. So again, Brettanomyces is one of those flavors that could be in a beer on purpose. It could also not be in a beer on purpose. And if you get that Band-Aid flavor, that is a dead giveaway that you have Brettanomyces in that beer. And I didn't mean to get so in the weeds about Brettanomyces, but I do like to give examples of when we're talking about esters and phenols from fermentation, from yeast, what it is precisely that we're talking about. Okay, so then we're going to wrap up with some best practices. When we're talking about developing your palate, it is, I can't emphasize enough that developing your palate, increasing your evaluation skills takes time and it takes practice. There are some days that, I can sit down to a blind tasting and I nail every single one. I'm the best beer taster who's ever lived. Nobody can touch me. I can sit down the next day and not get anything right because I don't know anything about beer and I should just quit. There are ranges and it depends on the day. And for me, the biggest challenge is getting my brain to shut up and listen to kind of what my intuition, what that knowledge bank that I have is telling me. I talk myself out of a lot of correct decisions when it comes to evaluating beer. And every time I'm really angry with myself that I did it. So just know that it takes time and it takes practice, but it will come. And, I can't remember the exact day, but I do remember studying for my certified Cicerone and doing a panel, like a blind panel at home. And one day I just could smell one beer and I said, this is an ale. and I smelled the next beer and I said, this is a lager. And I didn't set out that day to be able to tell the difference between the two, but I smelled it and I said, this is a lager. And and it was just popped into my brain and popped out of my mouth, and I was correct. So that will come. Trust the process, trust that you will be able to do that. Understand that there will be days that you are doing a terrible job and it's very frustrating, but that's just one day out of many days. So don't give up on that. Another thing that's super important, that particularly as you go out into the world as a beer judge, being a woman for now, you will not be, you will be underrepresented. And that, for a lot of reasons, women tend to get talked over and tend to be told or mansplained to about a lot of things. So always keep in mind that you are the best judge of what you are tasting. And what we're learning here over the next few weeks is how to put what you are tasting, what you are perceiving, into that commonly accepted language. So you're not wrong about what you're tasting. And, all learning to evaluate beer means is you're improving your ability to dig into what you can perceive and how you can communicate it. And it's happened to me. I was at National Homebrew, the competition a couple of weeks ago, and saw it happen to a judging pair next to me, where one judge was very dominant and just immediately started saying, this is what this beer is, this is what this beer is. And the other judge said, I got this flavor from it. And he immediately said, no, that's not what you're tasting. You're tasting this. And that is terrible practice. As a judge, you should never do something like that. And you can't dictate to somebody what it is that they're tasting. But just know that it happens. And remember that you are the best judge of what you are tasting. If you're paired with a good judge, they will help you walk through that process of, okay, you said you smelled perm solution. That's probably going to be, some sort of a sulfur-based compound, and working through it that way. Nobody should tell you that you are wrong about what you are tasting. So just remember that you're the best judge of what you're tasting. Remember that at all times. Stay persistent, try not to get too frustrated, and keep practicing. If, again, all you taste right now is beer flavored beer, that's totally fine. We will get you to, to be able to develop your descriptive vocabulary. And I had mentioned this before too, develop your routine. Figure out what works for you when you're evaluating beer and what signals to your brain that it's time to shift from merely drinking beer to evaluating beer. For me, it's doing that swirl. And if I'm in particularly in a testing environment, I will just give you all this insight into my insane methodology that signals to me that this is what we're doing right now. I have to get everything on my table lined up perfectly. Like my pen is perpendicular to my score sheet, which is parallel to the table edge, and I've got my samples in front of me. Actually, I said my pen is perpendicular, but I usually will move it to be parallel. I cross my left foot over my right foot. When my hair is long enough, I pull my hair back. I take a moment. I breathe in, I breathe out, and then I get started. And, going through that each time is just like, okay, like, hey, brain, hey, body, we just did these 5 steps. It's time to taste some beer. So develop that routine that works for you. And and continue to do that, and understand that as that whatever works for you, and that's the correct way to do it. When you are tasting beer, we're extremely susceptible to suggestions. So especially when it comes to aroma and flavor, and it can happen without even realizing it. And one of the examples I have for that was I was judging at a professional competition a couple of years ago, and there was a judge at the table next to us who, we'll say, it wasn't exercising the most judgely conduct, and would just be like, oh yeah, I get this, I get that, and just very, very loudly kind of stream of consciousness talking out loud, which if you're in a judging situation, don't do that. But she said, I get lilac and honey in this beer. And my judging partner, we were judging a completely different style. We were judging something like American IPAs. where she smelled it and said, I get a lot of lilac and honey. And she didn't even realize that that was something she had overheard. And again, as good judge conduct, I'm not going to say that you're wrong, but I will say, she also just said that out loud. So let's kind of talk through this a little bit more and see, just knowing that that was just that, hearing that and processing it, and not even being conscious of it. That happens very easily, especially with aroma and flavor. If you were drinking a beer right now, if I said, everybody take a drink of beer right now, and I say tortilla chip, you're all going to be like, yeah, how did I get tortilla chip in that beer? It's because we're very susceptible to the power of suggestion. So it's important to maintain a quiet environment free from distractions. Don't discuss your perceptions until you're finished. Silence your phones, any kind of devices, anything that's going to kind of snap you out of that concentration. Don't eat anything strong, spicy, greasy, any kinds of that food or beverage ahead of time. Because that again is going to coat your palate. It's going to affect your flavor perceptions. Don't smoke cigarettes like ahead of time or ever. Just think through anything that's going to affect your palate. Don't do it. Don't do it for about 30 minutes before any time you're going to sit down and drink beer. Another thing that I've done before is I was making Indian food one night, and I'm going to do a blind panel, and it didn't even occur to me how silly that was to try to do that in the same room, because as I'm, evaluating beer, it's like, man, everything really tastes like garlic and ginger, or smells like garlic and ginger tonight. And then realizing that, well, yeah, like 10 feet away from me, I'm cooking this very fragrant dish that is now filling up my kitchen that smells amazing, but it's not really great in terms of evaluating beer. So just be aware of your environment. Also, no cologne, no other kind of heavily scented products. For purposes of evaluation, anything with added scent, consider that a scented product. If you're using hand sanitizer, don't have the most flavor aroma neutral hand sanitizer you can have. Same with lotion. No cologne, no perfume at all, because that is going to disrupt not only your ability to perceive what you're evaluating, but everybody around you. So if you think about the person who comes into work with a lot of body spray on, or a lot of cologne, that that can be all you smell. It fills up a room. And you will find, particularly as you move through this process of learning to evaluate beer and really learning to pick apart what you're smelling, you will become more sensitive to smells, and you will be able to pick up on that. So no added scent the day that you're doing an evaluation, not only for yourself, but for people around you. So some action items for this week. Set aside some time to evaluate mindfully. So we just walked through the score sheet and some flavors. Grab a beer, grab your BJCP guidelines, grab a score sheet, and just evaluate a beer. Decide if, not my homebrew, but decide if your homebrewed version of an American IPA is a good version of it or not. And if not, why not? Use the score sheet or free write. Going back to that, what is the beer shouting at you? Just write down, what is it that I'm smelling when I take just a big whiff of this beer, or when I do the covered swirl and sniff. What is this beer shouting at me right now? And you can free write those if you'd like. So either one, just set aside some time this week to evaluate mindfully, and then also work on reverse engineering those perceptions into what ingredient you can likely attribute each flavor. And I know a lot of you have been really active on our Discord channel. Go onto the Discord channel and just put that in like the general section, and we'll work through that and help each other pick out what those flavors are that we're tasting. The next thing I would suggest to do this week is pick a category to smell and taste. So if you've got bread products in your house, what does flour taste and smell like? What is just regular bread crust, make toast, burn the toast, taste all of those, get an idea of what those flavors are. The same for citrus fruits, spices, sugars, flours, anything really, anything that you've got. We have most of us have ingredients in our house. So we have all those different things in front of us. Just set aside some time to smell and taste it. I know I've gone into a spice store before and said, hey, when I read about English hops, it says that they're herbal. If I say herbal to you, what spices does that mean to you? And the person's like, oh, I would think maybe like sage, marjoram, I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, but they said these are what I think of, and they asked somebody else, what do you think of when you say herbal? And a lot of those overlapped. So it was like, okay, that's, I'll get some of these spices and smell them and get an idea for what herbal might smell like. So those are your 2 action items for this week. If you're looking to, really take what we've talked about here tonight and put it into practice. So then the last thing I'm going to wrap up with is some additional resources for you. If going through this, you're like, I love sensory. I want to know more about sensory. That's me. That's my life. I always want to learn more about sensory. So some additional resources. Again, you do not need these for the BJCP exam. Don't feel like these are things you need to go spend money on. I like to put these additional resources if you like to learn more, because people are always really excited to learn about sensory. And, like the human body is pretty cool and does some pretty cool and also some pretty weird things. So Draft Lab is actually the flavor maps behind me. These are the Draft Lab flavor maps. That is a company, a sensory company that was started by Lindsay Barr, who was formerly of New Belgium for several years and was in charge of their sensory program. I actually got the opportunity to pop in at the end of one of her presentations last week for the Crafted for Action conference. And I fangirl anytime I'm around Lindsay, and spent like a good, probably close to a good minute when she was first like, oh, hey, Jen, welcome. Just being like, I love you so much. And I love everything you do. And this is amazing to be up here with you. And then realized that I was making it like super weird, because we're on a couple of different working groups together too. And just realized that I was making it super weird. So anyway, anything that Draft Lab does is absolutely fantastic. One thing they do that I really, really love is they have a YouTube channel where they have a ton of different videos. I would also highly recommend following Draft Lab on Instagram, and as well as following Sample Ox on Instagram. That is more of the consumer facing sensory app that Draft Lab has. But on both of those, they will have just little like 1 or 2 minute long, like, hey, the ocean smells like DMS and here's why. And just really cool, fascinating things to learn about sensory. So highly recommend checking out Draft Lab on YouTube, on Instagram, as well as their flavor maps. Again, this isn't something that you need to feel like you need to go out and purchase, but the flavor maps, as you're learning to develop your sensory vocabulary, I do recommend those. There is a beer flavor map that is very good, that gives you a very good overview. I think they're about $15 or so. And then, we also have like the hop flavor map, base malt, specialty malt. There's different kinds of flavor maps. There's actually like cheese, whiskey, all sorts of stuff. I highly recommend the flavor maps. Books. I have this huge stack of books back here about sensory and I've got them on the slide, so I don't know why I need to actually grab them to show them to you, but some books that I recommend if you're interested in learning more about sensory. The first one we'll say is Tasty by John McQuaid. This is a book that I started reading because it was a recommended resource for Advanced Cicerone, and I love this book. It's also available as an audiobook. It's fascinating, and it's got a ton of really great information, and it will teach you a lot about how you perceive things. The next one I have is, I'm just going to go in the order that I have them here, Cork Dork. This is actually about a woman's quest to become a sommelier within a year. And, reading through this and the way that she goes about developing her palate, one is just a very entertaining read. But there's a lot of great information from the wine world, from sommeliers in this book that is shared, that I highly recommend. This is one of those books that when I got it, I think I read it in like a day and a half. It was just reading this book was the only thing I was doing. The next one that I would recommend is What the Nose Knows. This is by Avery Gilbert. This is a very heavily focused on aroma, obviously what the nose knows, and just has a ton of amazing information in it. So Avery Gilbert is a professional perfumier, so he's a professional nose, and there's just so much science in this book that's just fantastic. And then I've got the last couple here, Bitter. This is a fantastic book. It also has recipes in it, but Bitter is a really great book that describes the bitter taste. And bitterness is something that is absolutely fascinating. And, some people can taste bitter better than others. And we have, I think it's something like 5 genomes that detect sweetness. And so far they've discovered something like 42 that detect bitterness. So as humans, we're very adept at sensing different kinds of bitterness. And that book will tell you all about it. The Deductive Beer Tasting Method by Rich Higgins, I don't actually have that as a book. I have it as the electronic book, but he sets forth, he's a master cicerone, he's also a sommelier, and he sets forth kind of his own method for tasting beer. And I think that's just a really great resource because he approaches it a little bit differently from the BJCP and has developed this as kind of a marriage between how we are evaluating beer in the beer world and how wine is evaluated in the wine world, and kind of bringing those two worlds together. And then the last one I have to suggest for you is Neurogastronomy. I'll be honest, I have not made it all the way through this book yet. It's not as engaging as some of the other books are. And actually, speaking of engaging, my very last book this time, I promise, is Nosedive by Harold McGee. Some of you may be familiar with Harold McGee from the Art of Cooking. And I don't think that's actually the name of it now that I think about it. But Harold McGee, this book is absolutely amazing. A Field Guide to the World's Smells. It has been so useful as a reference to me, just learning about different compounds that we smell and how those may be present in beer. That is the end of my show and tell for all of the books. If you are interested in exploring that more, definitely I recommend checking any of those or all of those out. So that is the very end that I have of the slides. And I apologize. I see that I'm a couple of minutes over, but I did want to answer the rest of these questions that we have. And yes, Sheena, I just saw all the books pop up. Like, buying books and reading books are 2 completely separate hobbies. I have read all of these except for Neurogastronomy, but they're all very good. Okay, so I tend to conflate farmhouse and saison when tasting. Are farmhouse ales always Brettanomyces? No, that is actually a good question, Cindy. So thank you for making that distinction. Sometimes you may see a saison is a farmhouse style. So when we're talking about farmhouse styles, that's not a, like a style within the BJCP guidelines, but the spirit behind something like a saison is that you're brewing with the ingredients that you have available on your farm. And so something like a saison, might have spelt, it might have wheat, it might have rye, it might just be, all barley. Saison is a style developed as a way to kind of preserve those raw ingredients and also create sustenance for your farmhouse workers. So farmhouse doesn't always necessarily mean Brett. So thank you for asking about that and making me make that distinction. Generally, if you see something listed as farmhouse, it is going to have Brettanomyces flavors in it. And I don't know if I helped clarify your question at all with that. And then let me see what else we have. Okay, the full sentences, Emma, this is a fantastic question, and I will wrap up on this. When you're filling out the score sheet, no, don't bother with full sentences, particularly with I would say don't bother with full sentences except for the overall impression. So if I'm filling out a score sheet, I might, in the aroma, it might look something like moderate lemon peel hop aroma, low bread dough and honey malt aroma, no esters, or maybe like light fruit esters or like light palm fruit esters, no phenols, or clean, overall clean fermentation character. And then in the overall impression category, or that section of the score sheet, is where I would put a full sentence, say like, overall, I really enjoyed this beer. It's a great representation of the style. And then go into, I got a little diacetyl in the aroma and a little bit in the flavor. So, and then make my recommendations for how to potentially correct for diacetyl. But usually the overall impression section is the only place where I'm writing in full sentences. All right, let me see. Next week, should we grab samples of the styles you will be talking through? If you can, if that's something that you're financially able to do, definitely do it. You don't have to. I think next week we're really like ripping the Band-Aid off and going through 11 styles. So each week, if you want to grab one of the samples, particularly if it's a style that you are not familiar with, then I would recommend looking for, first looking for commercial examples. So we talked about that last week. In your BJCP app or in your guidelines, there's a section called commercial examples. And that's going to walk you through what, commercial examples are those beers that really define what the beer should taste like. And if you can, I would start with commercial examples. So if we're talking, next week, we're talking about American lager. Examples of American lager are going to be Budweiser, PBR. I'm blanking on all the other kinds of American lagers right now. Keystone, Miller, Michelob, all of those are going to be American lagers. Grab one of those and work through the score sheet kind of as we're talking through the style, or just have it to, just drink while we're talking about each one of the styles. Next week is going to be a little tough because we're going to hit so many that we're not going to spend a ton of time on any one. But I would suggest either having a style that you taste as we go through each week, or just sometime that week. Maybe that week is you'll grab an American lager to practice filling out your score sheet, and doing that after we discuss the styles. So on that note, thank you, everyone. I apologize that we are going 7 minutes over this time, but I really appreciate all of you joining me tonight and your questions. And one last thing I will say, I know that I've had a couple of people ask like, hey, is it too late for my friend to sign up? Or I just learned about this, what did I miss? This is designed to be ongoing. So if you have somebody who's interested in joining, please encourage them to join. I don't want anybody to feel like they've missed out or somehow can't jump in at any time. So on that note, you all know how to reach me. Thank you so much. Please stay strong, particularly if you're in the brewing industry right now. It hasn't been a particularly easy past few days, but in solidarity, we all stand together. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your night, and I will see you again next week.